Off the record. The concept of a parasite and the reality of one are usually two very disconnected things. While there are horrendous parasites out there that will absolutely body you given the chance, most just inspire the feeling of disgust and hate, which basically results in you getting out the parasite from your body and immediately destroying it. With most animals, they're usually none the wiser that they are really even infected with anything. Sure, nutrition is stolen from their bodies, but consciously, there is not any knowledge within their heads that they are hosting something stealing their resources. With humans though, it's different. When we become sick with something that can't be handled with antibiotics or rest, we start to get a little concerned about what's making us sick. Upon realizing that you may have a literal worm within your guts or botfly larva underneath your skin, this makes people, understandably, feel sickened. This has always been the issue with parasites in humanity because we are more capable than your average host. And because of that, the very subtlety that the parasite used to get into your body will inevitably be used against it as it continues to grow and continue its life cycle. Then its initial sneaking around your meat suit will be discovered and with medicine can most likely be destroyed. But what if you just didn't care? What if the parasite actually in some ways made you stronger and even replaced your brain while still keeping you as you? That would be a parasite that has quite literally adapted to a human in every possible way.
Item number SCP-150. Object class Keter. Special containment procedures. SCP-150 patients kept for study should be contained in Level 3 biohazard containment cells with no more than one instance per cell. Cultures of SCP-150 are contained in vacuum-sealed gas flasks in Site-42 infectious material labs. Standard pathogen handling procedures should be followed at all times. Any instances of SCP-150 found outside of the containment are to be incinerated. Description: SCP-150 is an obligate parasite that resembles the tongue-eating louse Cymothoa Exigua, but is adapted to form conjunctive symbiotic relationships with humans for a period of its lifespan. Upon contact with the human subject, SCP-150 embeds itself deeply in the flesh of its host. Over the course of approximately 7 days, the parasite will burrow into the host and cause numerous physiological alterations.
Interestingly, this parasite is naturally adapted to taking over the bodies of fish, which is exactly why I would say the parasite is specifically seeking out humans to infect and have their young grow within them. At some point, the leap from fish to human was made, but unlike the fish, which has its tongue eaten, to which the parasite attaches to the blood supply, this specific parasite seems to have gone well past what its original form did. When interacting with a human host, the first thing it must overcome is our ability to literally rip it off of our skin. It's quite clear it's likely not immediately entering our mouths and eating our tongues, which means it must be entering the body in another way, likely either in a larval form, which then burrows into the skin as mentioned previously, and this would be actually floating around the water, and also it could possibly be in the water droplets we expel by coughing, which is further supported by this document. I would actually go out on a limb to say that SCP-150 may have a direct link to the creatures seen from the microbiologists who were studying in the Chesapeake Bay, which has been discussed previously in these logs on this channel, despite some unknown authorities attempting to take them down. Regardless, there are also numerous effects that this creature has on the body, which we need to discuss how these happen, but first set the stage for what's happening.
Description continued. The most glaring alteration is the gradual conversion of the limbs nearest to the infection site into chitinous appendages. As SCP-150 consumes the host's flesh, it excretes tissue that replaces and augments the functionality of the host's limb without causing transplant rejection. It is suspected that SCP-150 is able to secrete anesthetic and immunosuppressant substances to prevent the host body from responding to the change. Furthermore, the numerous tissue excreted by SCP-150 is able to interface with the host's nervous system. By the time this process is complete, the host is able to control the affected limb with no loss of mobility, often with improved strength, reflexes, and resilience.
As SCP-150 continues into its life cycle, it will require the host's own tissue in order to properly grow its own body. However, what's interesting is, despite this creature technically being parasitic in name, the reality is by definition the interaction is really somewhat symbiotic. The host gains something from being infested with SCP-150, and SCP-150 gains the ability to reproduce itself by being with the host. However, what's gained by the host is quite interesting as it hints at potentially SCP-150 actually wanting to keep the host alive. alive. Let's be honest, if SCP-150 were to consume a host from the inside out, then likely the wounds would become much too grievous extremely quickly, which would result in the expiration of the host, and unless SCP-150 was able to continue on to another host, which isn't guaranteed as quarantine measures would be quickly enacted, considering it's really adapted to humans, it must somewhat understand humans. By replacing the tissue and releasing anesthesia to lower pain and also releasing immunosuppressants to keep inflammation down, this would help the host not become alarmed and would stop them from seeking help. But again, showing the knowledge of a human, or at least showing it has knowledge of a human, SCP-150 also has compatible dendritic connections, which is stated later in this document, in which to exploit an interface with the nervous system. Now, typically the nervous system would report things like pain, which the anesthesia aspect of its secretions would help quell. But what's really effective, however, is a nerve blocker, something that actually stops the pain signals from traveling up the spine altogether. Likely the parasite is drawn to this area of electrical activity, and as a result, it can actually stop pain signals by how it is able to interact. Once the entire process is complete, as stated, the limb moves quite well and is improved to boot. That would mean that the tissue secreted is naturally more durable than our own, but I would hesitate to say the improved strength is actually a good thing. We naturally cannot tap into all of our strength and typically are relegated to about 30 to 50% of it in order to protect our bones, muscles, tendons, ligaments, and joints. Considering SCP-150 has access to these nerves and also has the ability to secrete tissues that can interact with these nerves, it's pretty clear that they may be overriding the body's natural preservation mechanisms in order to have full utilization of the strength. Normal human tissue would break down from what we have seen, but if the muscle has been replaced by SCP-150 tissue, then this means that they could in theory contract harder, but again, I hesitate to say that this is the case, which I will actually go into a little later on. As the initial contact with SCP-150 continues on, eventually it will reach a point where the next stage in the life cycle is achieved, reproduction. This would mean that likely this parasite reproduces asexually unless there are multiple male and female parasites within the body, which is interesting as this is a break from the original species where they start off as male initially and then as they mature they become female.
Description continued. For a period of 1 to 2 weeks, SCP-150 will reproduce, feeding on nutrients and depositing eggs into the assimilated blood vessels. The eggs are deposited throughout the human body via the bloodstream. While the vast majority of them die off, enough survive to begin colonizing and altering the rest of the host body. Though subject reports discomfort and occasional loss of motor control during this process, they often will not recognize the cause of said discomfort. It is still unclear why the offspring do not compete with one another for space or resources, nor how the assimilation process leaves the body cell signaling mechanisms and processes unaffected. SCP-150 reproduces during this assimilation process. As the lungs are assimilated, more eggs are produced and then spread out by the patient's coughing. Although as many as 10,000 eggs may be produced during this time, it is estimated that only 1% of them find their way into another host, and of which 1% survive the host's immune response and implant successfully.
One of the interesting aspects, as stated by the log, is that as the parasite continues to interact with the body, eventually a tipping point is reached, where SCP-150 has essentially become a part, if not the entire, nervous system, which is where we will get to the brain actually in a moment. It would appear that on a cellular level, the parasite is not only able to interact with the human cells, but also mimic the cell with the same cellular markers on its surface. And this may suggest that even as the cell is ingested into the parasite, it may not be so much destroyed, but instead changed from the inside. And this could imply that the tissue secreted after the fact is actually still human tissue, but with the addition of something that comes from the parasite. This thing added could be something as simple as an enzyme that improves metabolism, or even a string of new genes added into the actual genetic coding of the cell, which is then expressed. Upon expression, new proteins can be made and the actual metabolism again may become more efficient in the process. There are quite a few possibilities as to how the cell is altered, but without further examination of these cells, I am inclined to believe that it is still human tissue altered in some way by SCP-150 internally and then is secreted back out. Apart from the immunosuppressants, which may be trying to throw off the eosinophils from destroying SCP-150 itself, considering that it can destroy the young, the new tissue appears to assimilate perfectly into the body as it's always been there, which says that it may have all the appropriate markers on it, identifying itself as a part of the original host, which for any secretions would just be really hard to do. The other possibility is that once the cell is destroyed, the genetic coding is taken off of the actual cell itself, or from the cell itself, and then that coding is then added into the new cells created by SCP-150 that then is secreted. Once here, the cellular markers stating that the cell is a part of the host are presented on the surface due to the human genetic coding there of the secreted cells. I believe, though, I may have a note to add about the creatures not competing with one another. It would seem that as they grow within the host, eventually the entire host will be changed into a colony, as discussed later. This would imply that the species are actually eusocial. Having come from the same parent, they would work together as a single cohesive unit, and everything we have seen from 150 means they understand their prey and host to a much greater extent than your standard parasite. This may also hint at them being a hive mind type of intellect that we are dealing with. This may also be explained as they are able to interact with the human nervous system, which means they have the ability to communicate amongst themselves as well by using potentially the same method they do to actually secrete cells and then interact with human nervous systems. We now approach the biggest reason as to why I believe the host cells are simply taken in and changed by potentially implanting a new set of genes in the genetic structure of that cell.
Description: Conclusion. Although SCP-150 inevitably results in the assimilation and alteration of the central nervous system, including the spinal cord and brain, the host's consciousness and behavior are seemingly unaffected. Interviews with subjects infected by SCP-150 have yielded little information, as infected subjects unaware of SCP-150 claim to sense no changes or improvement in certain senses and faculties. While subjects aware of the infection are able to pinpoint the source of the change, they exhibit little to no negative feelings and often express positivity towards it.
The key here is the intricacies of the brain are astronomically hard to copy. In fact, there could be 15,000 connections of each neuron in the brain, of which there are quite literally 10 billion neurons in total, about on average. Restructuring that by simply being a parasite would be impossible, and this would ultimately have some pretty profound impacts on the host, as if they were not cells, then they could not communicate as such. Instead, however, what we see based on the experiments conducted on 2 D-class personnel, which I'll put the transcript up on screen, the brain is still functional, possesses all the same connections, and upon removing pieces, only then, just like with your own brain, is affected. However, adding them back in reforms these connections. I would hypothesize then that the connections must be preserved by the original cell, and the cells are influenced by the parasite genes added. It should be noted that, as stated, when the cells are removed, they can move and then appear to look like the parasite as well, which brings up an interesting question. Is SCP-150 actually this parasite? We know this parasite exists in the wild right now, but how it conducts itself and its chosen prey, I would bring up a point that while the parasite seems familiar to us and what we know about how it interacts with fish, it may just simply be another intermediate host to SCP-150 as well, meaning that it really could be coming from something else entirely. Because it is able to take the form of a creature but also assimilate our cells as well into us being us, but not really being us, it seems plausible that the parasite we think it is might not really be it. But unfortunately, that's really just speculation on my part. Ultimately, it is a Keter class SCP because should it get out and infect multiple people who may not even know, this might just be the start of it. Anybody can be infected because they don't know they're infected. Any brain can be altered because it doesn't know if it's altered. And that brings up the next point of if human reproduction is even capable for those infected with SCP-150. In the end, it could essentially be an extinction level event if not handled quickly and appropriately. But I believe how to handle that is to first figure out if SCP-150 is truly this parasite.